Many of you have watched my video on St Edward's chair, the coronation chair, in which the king will be seated for his anointing, investiture and crowning in May. In that video I explore the history of that object and the symbolism of it in some depth. But a lot of people have asked me in the comments box why St Edward's chair isn't called St Edward's throne. In this video, I intend to clear up the confusion of this question by looking at the geography, the layout of Westminster Abbey as it is prepared for the coronation. As we will see, the king sits in 3 seats during the course of the coronation ceremony, but only one of them is in fact his throne. By giving you a guide to the visual context and plan of the Abbey, I hope this video will make it easier to understand not only this, but the ceremonial actions that will enliven this space in May, which I will discuss over the coming weeks. If you enjoy my videos, don't forget to like and share. That helps others find the channel too. You may see that I'm now offering channel membership here. This is a way for you to support me in developing the channel, but also to receive extra content and perks. You'll see a join button at the bottom of my videos and on the channel homepage. There are quite a few perks to being a member. You get to see content before it goes live on the channel. There's access to other exclusive content, including longer courses, monthly live streams, and access to the channel Discord server. Do please consider joining if you like what you see here and you want to see even more. Today, Westminster Abbey is in the heart of London, but that was not always the case. In the 1040s, King Edward the Confessor chose to build himself a new palace close to London, and he placed it on a rather boggy island to the west of the city called the island of Thorney, next to a small Benedictine monastery that had been founded a century earlier by his predecessor King Edgar and St Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury. The island was formed by a number of rivulets of the River Tyburn, just at the point where they flowed into the Thames, and it was a helpful place to build a palace should a time of crisis emerge, because it was partly defensive. The palace in time became the Palace of Westminster, now of course housing Parliament. Since the 16th century, Thorney has no longer been an island, the Tyburn having been long buried in culverts. King Edward chose to re-endow and rebuild King Edgar's monastery next to his palace, and he built a new stone church for it dedicated to St Peter. It was named the Westminster. Minster means monastery, to differentiate it from St Paul's Cathedral in London, which was the East Minster. The church was completed in 1065 and was dedicated only a few days before Edward's death. There is little left now of the structure of King Edward's church, as it was completely rebuilt from the mid-13th century onwards by the Plantagenet kings. The present Westminster Abbey, to give it its full title since the Reformation, the Collegiate Church of St Peter at Westminster, was constructed by King Henry III, the work commencing in 1245. The mason who oversaw the work was the king's own master mason, Henry of Rheims. His origin is uncertain, but it has been suggested that he was from Rheims and had been involved with the construction of the French Coronation Church, the Cathedral at Rheims, which was constructed in the 1230s and was completed in 1241. Henry III was not willing to be outdone by the French king, and he wanted to construct a new royal church for himself that matched Rheims and, like it, was in the latest Gothic fashion. Architecturally in this period, though not for long, England took its cue from French fashion. Henry of Rheims was tasked with designing a new church that had 3 primary functions. Firstly, it was to be a monastic church of a community of Benedictine monks who prayed their round of daily prayer there, and it had to be practical for their services and also for the celebration of the conventual mass. Secondly, it was intended to be a place of pilgrimage and a royal mausoleum, a burial place for Henry III and his family, with their burial place surrounding a new shrine to St Edward the Confessor, the penultimate Saxon king. Henry had a particularly strong devotion to his predecessor. Thirdly, it was designed to be a practical space for the coronation of English kings, every one of whom has been crowned here from the time of William the Conqueror onwards. So the plan of Westminster Abbey is in many respects rather unique, having to accommodate these three very particular needs. In 1253, Henry of Ross was replaced by an English mason called John of Gloucester, who was replaced in turn by Robert of Beverley around 1260. They simply put into action the plan that Henry of Ross had made, though they developed the detail. It was a long job building the abbey. Henry III kept running out of money continuously, and the work of construction, which began at the east end of the church, was only completed as far as the choir, and the church finally consecrated in October 1269. It was in October 1269 that St Edward the Confessor was translated. He was moved from his original grave to a new shrine behind the high altar. Henry III lived on for another 3 years after the work was completed, being buried in his great new abbey, the first English king since the Norman conquest to be buried in the abbey, and thus setting a trend. And the building was used as it was intended to be for the coronation of his son Edward I in August of 1274. The coronation of the British sovereign takes place at the east end of Westminster Abbey, that part of the building that Henry III constructed, and it's the most sacred part of the building. Like many medieval English monastic churches, the abbey ground plan is in the shape of the cross. At the centre is a crossing, which is lit from above by a low central tower or lantern, which is now 18th century, but replaces one dating from the end of the Middle Ages. To the west of the crossing is the choir, where the choir stalls are to be found, and where the medieval monks of Westminster Abbey would have sung their services, and where the daily services of the dean and chapter of the abbey still take place. Then beyond that is the nave. The nave is divided from the choir by a large stone partition called the Great Choir Screen. The nave is the part of the abbey that in the Middle Ages was open to the public. Everything else beyond the choir screen was the preserve of the monastic community, which at the time of the Reformation was of course replaced by a dean and chapter. In May, the king will arrive for his coronation at the great west door of the abbey nave. He will process along the nave, he will pass under the great choir screen and will process through the choir, passing under the crossing tower and making his way to the sacrarium, the eastern arm of the chancel of the abbey church. The focal point of the sacrarium, this part of the church, is the high altar, where the service of Holy Communion will be celebrated at the coronation. Well, we hope so, and where the crowns and regalia are laid and blessed before they are used. When the king arrives, he will bow to the altar before taking his seat. Behind the high altar is a solid altar screen with 2 doors on either side of it, and these doors communicate through to the chapel of St Edward the Confessor. This contains at its centre the shrine of St Edward, and around him are arranged the tombs of Henry III and his descendants, including those of Edward I, King Edward III, King Richard II and King Henry V. Also buried here are Queen Consorts Eleanor of Castile, Philippa of Hainault, Anne of Bohemia and Catherine of Valois. It is to the chapel of St Edward the Confessor that the king will retire at the end of the coronation to change into his coronation robe and the imperial crown for the final procession out, and he will leave as he entered, through the choir, under the great choir screen, through the nave and to the great west door again. Between the time the king enters the abbey and his anointing, he is seated in the first chair he will use, and this is called the chair of estate. Now, if you want to know what this term estate means, watch my video on the imperial state crown that tells you all about it. The chair of estate is placed on the pavement facing north across the sacrarium towards St Edward's chair. The chair of estate is placed directly in front of what is believed to be the tomb of Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of King Henry VIII. The Queen will be seated in a chair of estate beside the King, and she remains there while the King is anointed, invested and crowned, right up until her own anointing and crowning. In front of the chairs of estate, which are not thrones, are placed false stools, kneeling desks for the King and Queen to kneel at prayer. The chairs of estate provided in the 20th century are all in the royal collection and are different in style. George V in 1911 chose a high-backed 17th century style chair with a gilt wood base and upholstered arms, with the back embroidered with his arms and with lots and lots of tassels. George VI chose a fully upholstered chair in plain crimson silk with his arms worked on the back in coloured silk thread. Elizabeth II's chair of estate was also 17th century in style, with a gilt wood base upholstered in a gorgeous pink damask, the back embroidered with her cipher within a garter, embroidered in coloured silk. At previous coronations, behind the chairs of estate and above the tomb of Anne of Cleves, a royal box was constructed, and the ladies of the royal family and the men who were not royal dukes would be seated here. I don't think we'll see a royal box in this position this time. The king is anointed, invested with the robes and royal regalia and crowned while seated in St Edward's chair, which was commissioned in 1296 by King Edward I. As this is the focal point of the most solemn parts of the ritual, this is placed at the entrance of the sacrarium and in the centre of it, facing east towards the high altar of the abbey and the shrine of St Edward. Now, you might imagine that the chair would be faced placing the people, like you see in historical movies, but there is a good reason why it isn't. The anointing and the investiture that take place here are the sacred hallowing of the sovereign for his new role. The altar in the abbey represents the presence of God in his temple, and in the Middle Ages, when the coronation rite was formed, the sacrament of the altar, the body and blood of Christ, was suspended above the high altar here in an object called a pyx. While the king is hallowed for his weighty office, he can therefore fix his eyes in devotion on Christ himself, who is the source of the blessing conferred upon him, and who, as the coronation ritual makes clear, is the model for all kingly rule. At no point in the ceremony is the king ever seated with his back to the altar. It is understood that this would show disrespect for Christ, who is the King of Kings. After his crowning, the king will rise from St Edward's chair and will be taken from the sacrarium to the space under the crossing tower of the abbey, an area that is known as the Coronation Theatre. Here another chair has been placed facing the high altar, and this, and only this seat, is the king's throne. The Coronation Theatre under the central crossing tower of the abbey is flanked on either side by two large transepts. Henry III designed this space with flanking transepts in order to house the political establishment who attended and witnessed to the coronation. Traditionally, this space has always accommodated the nobility of the realm at a coronation, with the royal dukes heading up the piers in the south transept and their peeresses in the north transept opposite, both groups given a good view of the king's enthroning. Now, we think of the word theatre as referring to a place where plays are put on, but that's not the original meaning of the word. The etymology of the word theatre means a place for viewing, a place to behold, and the purpose of enthroning the king on a throne in the Coronation Theatre is so that he can be beheld, he can be viewed by the people as the person the coronation ritual is intended to make him, a person who has been transformed by God, the anointed, invested and crowned sovereign of the nation. The king's throne is raised up on 5 steps above the floor of the theatre, so that the king can be easily seen by those assembled. And it's because of these steps that this seat is a throne and not a chair. The word throne, from the Greek thronos, means an elevated seat. A chair that's placed on a flat pavement, such as St Edward's chair, cannot by definition be a throne, as it's not raised up. When the king makes his way, crowned and invested in the royal robes and regalia, to his throne in the Coronation Theatre, he is lifted up into his elevated seat, his thronos, by the assembled bishops, the great officers of state, and the chief members of the nobility, and he takes possession of his kingdom. There is a theory that the steps supporting the king's throne, which form a sort of artificial mound in the Coronation Theatre, reflect the way Anglo-Saxon kings were enthroned on a great slab of stone atop a great mound of earth. At previous coronations, the king has remained seated in his throne while the homage takes place, and he remains there while the queen is anointed and crowned. The queen, as the consort and not the sovereign, does not sit in St Edward's chair for her coronation, but is anointed and crowned while kneeling at the bottom step of the high altar at a faldstool. Then she goes to join her husband on a second throne that is raised and placed to the left of his. As she is the consort, her throne is placed slightly lower than the king's, only 3 rather than 5 steps above the Coronation Theatre. When William III and Mary II were crowned and enthroned as joint sovereigns in April 1689, their thrones were placed at the same level, and Mary was crowned beside her husband in a replica of St Edward's chair, to make the point that they were being crowned as equals. Now, the king and queen remain seated in their thrones for much of the rest of the coronation ceremony. During the most solemn parts of the Holy Communion, they descend from their thrones and they make their way to 2 faldstools that are placed on the bottom step of the altar, where they kneel. In the 17th and 18th century, 2 more chairs of estate were provided for the king and queen in this position, so that they could be seated during communion, but these are no longer placed there. The king and queen then return to their thrones after receiving Holy Communion. It has become the tradition for new thrones to be provided for each coronation, a tradition that began as, quite unbelievably, the thrones were usually taken away afterwards. They were considered a perquisite by the Lord Chamberlain of the household, the senior officer of the royal household. Quite a few thrones survive in the collections of the English country houses owned by the Lord Chamberlain. Those used by George III, Queen Charlotte, William IV and Queen Adelaide are at Chatsworth House, the home of the Dukes of Devonshire, who were serving as Lord Chamberlain at these respective coronations. The thrones of George III and Queen Charlotte are elaborate gilt wood rococo chairs and wouldn't look out of place in the drawing room of a member of the aristocracy. Those of William IV and Queen Adelaide were made in 1827 for his brother George IV for the throne room at St James's Palace, and are, as you would expect, an example of Regency excess, gilt, overstuffed and ungainly. Since the reign of George V, the thrones have remained in the royal collection and have been placed in one of the throne rooms of a royal palace. The throne of Edward VII was almost as ostentatious and ridiculous as that of William IV, Grecian in style with the royal arms on the back and upholstered in cloth embroidered all over with roses, thistles and shamrocks, and the king's cipher. After that, the thrones commissioned have somewhat looked back to the past. The thrones of George V and George VI were traditional. They were X-shaped armchairs and were copied from an example dating from 1620 at Knole House in Kent. This was the sort of chair used as a throne in the 16th and 17th centuries. In 1953, Queen Elizabeth II's throne was made to match her chair of estate and looked for inspiration to the giltwood furniture of the Restoration period. It will be fascinating to see what choices are made for the coronation of Charles III and Queen Camilla in May. There is widely varying tradition. Until the 20th century, our sovereigns have been enthroned at their coronation on thrones that have been thoroughly modern in design. Perhaps the King and Queen will be enthroned in May on contemporary style thrones. Thanks very much for watching.